Hamlin Garland was born in 1860 in West Salem, Wisconsin, 10 miles east of the Mississippi River near La Crosse. He was the second of 4 children born to Richard and Isabel Garland. In 1869, 5 years after his father returned from the Civil War, the Garlands moved to a small farm just west of the Quaker village of Hesper in Winneshiek County, Iowa. "This farm immediately won our love," Garland wrote. "It was a glorious place for boys. Broad-armed white oaks stood about the yard, and to the east and north a deep forest invited exploration. The house was of logs, and for that reason was much more attractive to us than to our mother. It was, I suspect, both dark and cold. I know the roof was poor, for one morning I awoke to find a miniature peak of snow on the floor at my bedside." The following spring, the Garlands sold that farm and purchased a quarter section in Burr Oak Township, Mitchell County, Iowa. In August 1870, the family loaded its household goods into wagons and, with a small herd of cattle following, headed west. "On the afternoon of the second day," Garland reported, "we came to the meadow so wide that its western rim touched the sky without revealing a sign of man's habitation other than the road on which we traveled. That night, the Garlands arrived on a rented farm 1 mile north of their quarter section, where they stayed while constructing a house on their land. That rented cabin faced a level plain with no tree in sight. A mile to the west stood a low stone house, and immediately in front of us opened a half section of unfenced sod. To the north, as far as I could see, the land billowed like a russet ocean, with scarcely a roof to fleck its lonely spread. A neighbor helped Hamlin's father reinforce the cabin, hardly more than a shell of pine boards. The schoolhouse, which Garland attended, stood on the bare prairie on the northeast corner of his family's quarter section. It was painted a glaring white on the outside and a desolate drab within. At least drab was the original color. The benches were so greasy and hacked that its original intentions were obscured. It had 2 doors on the east end and 3 windows on each side. A long square stove standing on slender legs on a brick base, a wooden chair, and a crude table for the teacher in one corner completed the furniture. The walls were roughly plastered, and the windows had no curtains. There was not a leaf to shade it in summer, nor a branch to break the winds of savage winter. This building was later made into a chicken coop and eventually a corn crib. The newly built Garland house, the granary, sheds, and corn cribs on the family's quarter section were all constructed by Hamlin's father, Richard. The house was small, with only a kitchen and parlor downstairs. Bedrooms were on the second story, reached by climbing a ladder outside the house and entering through a window. Richard stacked bricks in the walls to hold the house against strong winter winds on the treeless prairie. Rough boards formed the house walls. The downstairs was plastered and was the only heated section of the house. In 1876, Hamlin entered the Cedar Valley Seminary in Osage. "The school was in truth a very primitive institution," wrote Garland, "hardly more than a high school, but it served its purpose." 140 years later, in 2016, the only building remaining from the Cedar Valley Seminary was moved several blocks east of its original location and is now a community gathering venue, a place for meetings, and a coffee shop. A plaque once bolted to the front of the building read, "Hamlin Garland, as a student here, 1876 to 1881, received his first literary inspiration, and from this environment came much of the material for his early fiction, his poems, and his Middle Border Chronicle." After a brief time teaching at a country school in Grundy County, Illinois, in 1883, Garland took up a homestead claim in McPherson County, Dakota Territory, eventually South Dakota, near Aberdeen. The next year, he mortgaged his claim for several $100s and went to Boston in an effort to embark on a career of letters. Hamlin Garland broke with the romanticism of his time to describe the harsh realities of farm life. His first success was Maine Traveled Roads, a collection of short stories published in 1891, inspired by his years in the Midwest. Having toiled on his family's farm from the age of 10, Garland had no interest in the rose-tinted views of rural life often portrayed in late 19th century novels. The time has come to tell the truth about the barnyard's daily grind, asserted Garland. In 1893, Hamlin moved from Boston to Chicago. The next decade was vitally important to both his personal life as well as to his professional career. He lectured on a wide range of topics, primarily literary subjects, and continued to write poems, short stories, and novels. In 1895, he published Rose of Dutcher's Cooley, a landmark in his literary development. As one biographer noted, by selecting a woman as his central character, Garland had deliberately ventured into deeper waters. In the mid-1890s, Garland began visiting the American West, making notes about cowboys and mountain scenery so unlike his native Midwest. He also began to study the American Indian, taking copious notes for later use in both fiction and nonfiction. Many of his Indian stories were published in The Book of the American Indian in 1923. In 1896, he was commissioned by McClure magazine to write a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. After 2 years of exhaustive research, his work was serialized in the magazine and appeared in book form in 1898. That same year, in search of adventure and literary material, he journeyed to Alaska to both participate in and observe the Klondike Gold Rush. That trek resulted in 2 books, The Trail of the Gold Seekers and The Long Trail. In 1899, Garland married Zula Mae Taft, sister of his Chicago friend, sculptor Laredo Taft. That same year, Boy Life on the Prairie was published, a slightly fictionalized capture of his childhood years in Mitchell County, Iowa. During the first 15 years of the 1900s, Garland wrote a series of fictional works often set in the Mountain West, including The Eagle's Heart, published in 1900, a pioneering work in the development of perhaps America's most distinctive contribution to world literature, the Western. In 1916, Garland and his family, which included 2 daughters, moved from Chicago to New York City to be closer to his publishers and the literary scene. By this point, Garland was wearying of writing fiction and turned to reminiscing about his early life. The result was A Son of the Middle Border, an autobiographical history of westward expansion, published in book form in 1917 to almost universal acclaim. Its success prompted a second volume, A Daughter of the Middle Border, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 1922. In 1931, Garland moved to Hollywood, California, in part to be nearer to his now adult daughters. There he spent his final years writing primarily books that reminisced about his life as a man of letters. As one biographer noted, at all events, Garland bore the hallmark of a famous writer. He was considered a distinguished host and was a welcome guest at any dinner table. After many honors and having secured a distinguished place in American literature, Hamlin Garland died in March 1940. He was buried in Neshonoke Cemetery near West Salem, Wisconsin, where his life had begun almost 8 decades earlier.